He learned, quietly and dangerously, that words could be weapons in a room full of crystal. The Rothwell Lounge smelled of saffron and butter and two fresh citrus lamps threw a pool of warm light onto a parade of white shirts and cufflinks. Servers moved like rehearsed shadows, silent, efficient, invisible until the moment a fork hit a plate wrong, and every head turned. Under the sheen of linen and lacquer there were other textures. A seam splitting along the sole of a shoe, a cooling bandage pressed into an old wound, the thin paper of unpaid hospital notices folded into the lining of a coat. Aaliyah Vance felt all of them at once, in the soles of her feet. She had been on them for 11 hours that night. Her shoes were held together by a strip of grocery store tape and a stubbornness that came from another life. 10 years before, a letter had sealed her acceptance to a doctorate at the Sorbonne. A photograph of her, holding that letter, had lived in a drawer by Samuel's bed. Scholarship in suburbia had once been two halves of the same dream. The scholarship fell through and Samuel had a stroke, and the bills arrived with the implacable efficiency of mail death notices. She had traded lectures for trays, seminars for serving shifts. The thesis, still half-written and folded into a lined notebook, spent its evenings under the café pot by the little apartment she shared with her father, who could no longer find the words he once spoke, so as, tonight, the lounge turned on its most practiced face. Reservations murmured like warm currents through the room. Patent leather shoes rested under polished tables. Aaliyah had a tray balanced against the small of her back, a linen cloth folded just so over one wrist. Her right hand had memorized the exact arc of a pour. She could have walked the path with her eyes closed. She did not. When Julian Blackwood arrived, he came in precisely the way people like him always did, as if the room had been designed for his entrance. He wore a suit with hard lines and a faint arrogance stitched into the tie. Elena was at his side, the kind of presence that frames a showpiece and softens it, apparently kind, faintly embarrassed by the performance that accompanied him. Julian's smile was a thin thing that knew how to open and close itself at will. He had the air of a man who bought influence for pocket change. He gave his order like a question thrown across a moat. The phrase wasn't meant to ask. It was meant to be heard by everyone in earshot, and to crown him king, however briefly, of a dining room already accustomed to crowns. He spoke an old Provençal phrase obsolete enough that most receipts in the city would not have a note of Iton arch and archaic flourish intended to make the staff feel small, to remind them who paid and who served. It was a line from a theater the world had stopped rehearsing. For a beat, no one moved. A shard of sound silver on crystal hung between the two of them. The dining room's laughter slid into an attentive hush. The servers at the pass looked up. Big Star Song. The floor manager checked his watch as if timing might reduce embarrassment. Marcel's jaw tightened where he stood near the service station. Sasha stopped midst. This was show business. Julian loved being the audience of himself. Aaliyah heard it the way a linguist hears a beat pattern in a heartbeat cadence, vowel, and intonation meant to mock. Her shoulders eased, not with submission but with a long inhalation that felt like the settling of a siege. She could have done nothing. She could have let the phrase curl and fall like smoke in a room that ate smoke and called it entertainment. But there was something in the tone petty, precise, that made a different muscle fire inside her. She answered. Not in the blunt, guttural English people expected in a downtown dining room, and not in some theatrical She spoke a short turn of the language Julian had practiced for his amusement. A phrase small, native, a simple recognition. It was a sound like a key that fit. She did not overwork it. She allowed the words to sit in the air where they could be examined. It landed with a different weight than Julian had intended. The laughter stopped. The server's steps slowed. Elena's hand tightened for an instant on the back of a chair, as if to steady herself against a sudden revelation. Voices in the corner soft. For a flash, the room recalibrated. That is not a greeting, Aaliyah said next. Her voice even, the cadence measured as if spoken from the end of a lecture podium. She translated what she had said. You are performing a provocation, not asking for oysters, but without flippancy. It was both correction and exposure. When she switched to Academy French to punctuate the point, the phrase came not like a scholar's boast, but like someone coming home and setting down a heavy thing. People who knew language could see the shape of it in how the consonants bent. Julian's smile stuttered. There is a particular sort of astonishment that someone expects never to have to feel, because the social architecture that coddles them gives that expectation as a right. He had not planned for a reply. He shifted, like a man realizing the stage has unexpectedly tilted beneath his feet. "Excuse me," he said, thin and performative. He tried to iron the moment back into normalcy with a practiced laugh, but the fabric had already been scored. The dining room sat forward, forks balanced with intent. A child at a nearby table ceased to drum a napkin against a glass. Victor caught Aaliyah's eye. For one glimpse she saw every calculation in his face. The fear of losing a table, the cost of a wrong gesture, the obligation to contain. Victor had his eye on profit and keeping a restaurant's reputation intact. In his ledger, Julian's table meant a cluster of metrics, tips, advances, a social photograph that could be shared with the right accounts. Aaliyah carried none of those metrics in the ledger. The managers watched. What she carried were other accounts with higher interest: her father's bed, the unwieldy stack of medical notices, the memory of a scholarship letter someone else had once confirmed with a phone call. The room motioned toward an equilibrium that favored Julian. The servers were trained to be invisible. Their training wove them into the furniture until their visibility was a breach. That was why the audacity of Aaliyah's reply mattered in a room taught to look but not see. By speaking, she refused invisibility. She refashioned the rules of the dining room in one small, scorching heartbeat. There was a ripple, then soft, then sharp, somewhere between the clink of crystal and the scraped chairs. Julian reached for balance by a move he seemed to have kept in reserve. Accusation. It is a blunt instrument. Accusation. You swing it to reclaim moral ground. You swing it to render your target vulnerable. Julian pulled the blade out and brandished it. "That's my card," he said. His voice had become a tool again, a level placed between him and the world. He looked at the check presenter as if the missing card were a slight inflicted on his dignity. "It's gone. Someone has taken my card." He did not look at Aaliyah when he said it. He looked at her as a type service staff, disposable, a person whose livelihood could be used to reassert a hierarchy. The accusation was meant to be louder than the language she had used. It was a performative thunderclap. Public, immediate, effective. Aaliyah's chest tightened not with fear, but with the knowledge of what this could quickly become. To be accused in a room like this was not only to stand accused, it was to be stripped in view of strangers, and then measured by their judgment. The staff had procedures. Victor had to protect the house and its guests. Police could be called. Security might detain. Contracts might be cited. The timeline of such matters was public and brutal. She did not grab for the card. The check presenter, an old leather folder, felt colder than usual in her palm. She had seen this script before in other restaurants, other rooms. An accusation as a club, an accusation as correction. She could name it. She could unweave it, word by word. She took a breath that did not tremble. "You're sure you used it?" she asked, carefully neutral. It was a small, practical question. The servers had learned that when a table complained, the best first move was a small inquiry, but she also wanted the record of an exchange to show she had invited accountability, not resistance. It would matter later, she thought, as a line in a ledger of truth. Julian's glare burned at her like a spotlight. He confirmed everything with the certainty of a man who'd always had the keys to doors opened for him. "Yes, I used it." Someone has taken it!" Victor tried to do what managers do, diffuse but calcify reality into manageable facts. "We'll check the table, Mr. Blackwood," he said. Marcel began the motions of looking under chairs. Sasha moved to the host station, and Toby hovered with a face like a ledger taking numbers. The staff performed a choreography meant to protect the restaurant. Check, apologize, reassure. The lie about invisibility was part of their profession. The truth was not. People turned their heads. Some looked at Aaliyah with instant distrust. Others watched with the thin hope that the accusation would evaporate and the thing would be over. Elena's face shifted into something like consternation. There was a flash in her eyes of premonition, half shame, half a dawning awareness that she may have been a prop in a crueler play than she had chosen. Aaliyah unbuttoned the cuff of her sleeve with a motion people rarely observed. It was the motion of someone making herself as little a target as possible while still being present. She pushed down the pockets of her trousers before the demand was even made. It was a ritual she'd learned to do when people asked to check. She pulled out nothing. Julian's voice sharpened. "Check her pockets," he said, turning cruelty into command as if directing an usher. "Check while we wait." There was a collective intake of breath at that. The request landed as if it had been flung, and the room had only two ways to receive it: to comply and to ratify, or to refuse and risk censure. The staff moved not out of choice but obligation. Victor's jaw worked. "Sir, there are procedures," he said, his voice stitched between professionalism and panic. There were cameras in the ceiling and a list of legal sensibilities in his pocket. He weighed one against the other with a calculator of risk. Aaliyah's hands were steady. She made a small sound, no more than a breath, and set down the check presenter on the side table. She raised her arms enough for a pocket search that would be polite by the restaurant's standards. She gave the staff nothing to despise in the way she offered compliance. She surrendered anything she had to surrender, but not herself. The room hummed with tension like a kettle just before it snaps. Patrons watched. The Kitchena universe away, but always eavesdropping, quieted for a moment. Marcel's fingers went into the inside pocket of Julian's jacket with the mechanical efficiency of a man whose pride was both defiant and exhausted. The air tightened. When Julian put his hand into his breast pocket, the sound he made was small, embarrassed, human. He had not expected, never expected, that when he looked for the card it would be there. His fingers closed around it, and he pulled it out. The color in his cheeks shifted for the fraction of a second that people notice only sometimes. The little variation that tells you someone who always pretended to be certain now had to account for being wrong. Aaliyah felt the shift like a temperature change. Around her, people began to adjust their postures back to neutral, an unthreading that was supposed to stitch everything back into place. Julian smiled the old smile, but it did not reach his eyes. He said the expected words, "Sorry," slight bow, a tiny apology scented with the same arrogance that had caused the offense. He hoped to collapse the moment, to return it to his ownership by offering the supposed reparation his class had trained him to give. But the room had seen the reversal now. Silence did not simply revert. People were not blank slates that could be pressed smooth again. The eyes that had watched a tower move had seen the tower settle, and shafts of sunlight now landed on stones they had missed. For a moment, Julian was visible in a way he had not expected to himself, perhaps, and to those sitting near him. Aaliyah's compliance had betrayed a different kind of strength. His contrivance had been exposed. Julian forced the apology into a different shape. "My mistake," he said, quicker than conviction. Obviously there was some confusion. He scanned the room like a man searching for a salvage point. He looked at Elena. Her expression was changing. There was, for an instant, sympathy there, the kind that picks at an edge with a fingernail and wonders what it finds. But Julian did not leave it. His posture shifted back toward aggression, not from necessity but from habit. The man who had been embarrassed was not content to be seen as fallible. He wanted dominance restored. He had an appetite not just for being noticed but for being unassailable. So he took a different path. He labored to transform humiliation into a spectacle of punishment. For someone like him, public correction was not enough. He wanted recompense. "Who is responsible for that kind of insolence?" he asked, meaning Aaliyah, but speaking wider. The question hung as if to summon a verdict. In the current social life of the restaurant, an accusation could be a net, and he wanted to throw it. Aaliyah's throat was a tight room. Words worked their way out in small, careful cadences. She could have named the inequality in the room, pointed out the way his laughter had been rehearsed to wound, explained the long line of sacrifices and unpaid bills that had brought her to that night, but she chose not to pontificate. Her answer was precise, exact, and intentional. "A provocation," she said. "A performance." There was a murmur that could have been surprise, or sympathy, or the first breath of indignation. Some patrons shifted in their chairs. A couple of people put down their forks as if the food had been irrelevant all along. The very fact she had the language to name it altered the room's calculus. Language was currency. Knowledge was a tool. To have the academic fluency to speak and define the action was to disarm the performative strike. Julian recovered his voice, but it sounded thinner now, like a man trying to rebuild a sandcastle with gloved hands. He snapped his fingers at a server, a small tyrant gesture that felt almost quaint against the sudden publicness of his error. He demanded that Aaliyah be taken aside, and that the staff explain how such an outrage could have been allowed. He invoked the police as a dark, theatrical Propan unseen blade, usable if he wanted to cut deeper. The staff shifted at the edges of their training. There are moments when institutional procedure is not simply a script, but a muscle memory. Victor pulled his phone out and scrolled, not yet calling anyone, but mapping out the options. Marcel's hands clenched into fists by the service station, and Sasha pressed a hand to her mouth because there are things you cannot watch without wanting to look away. Toby, who had learned his trade in small-town hotels before the city had swallowed him, looked as if he was waiting for the exact point when ordinary civility would either hold or dissolve. Aaliyah felt the world narrowing into a few precise elements, the touch of the linen at her wrist, the small place in her pocket where she kept a photograph of Samuel holding their old garden hose like it was a medal, the hum of the ventilation. She had rehearsed for this kind of wrong in small ways, making contingency plans inside her head, where to call, who could come, how to present evidence if it became necessary. She had not rehearsed how her pulse would feel when accused in front of people who preferred their discomfort to be invisible. Julian rose to his feet, a gesture meant to reassert authority by height. For a brief moment he looked less like a man and more like a human-sized puppet trying to occupy more space to hide a fragile center. He swept off his jacket and folded it over the back of his chair with a theatrical motion of superiority. The audience, it seemed, was still in place. That was his comfort. Then, against the choreography he had expected, something happened that none of them had fully anticipated. In a corner of the room that had always been slightly apart reserved, quiet, the nameplate on the door reading Rothwell in Guilt Someone Else had been watching. Maximilian Rothwell sat at a table with a glass of something old and clear. He had the composure of a man used to being the point of gravity in a room. The restaurant bore his name. He had the long, practiced look of someone who understood both the subtleties of power and the costs of letting it be weaponized. People knew he had money, and they knew he rarely exercised it in performance. He had been a quiet presence in the city's cultural conversations for years, more likely to quietly sponsor a restoration or quietly endow a chair than to parade. He had been in the business of stewardship rather than spectacle. Tonight he had been accompanied by a book someone had left with the Mater Dei, a slim volume on languages that had once been shelved in the Sorbonne's reading rooms. He had put it aside but had not turned his attention away from the room. When Julian's accusation exploded, Rothwell's gaze adjusted. He watched Aaliyah as a man would watch a painting that caught his eye, not hungry, not invasive, simply curious, with the sort of clinical attention power gives you. He knew the codes of rooms like this, the way sentences could be used not merely to communicate but to wound. His presence was weight. Sometimes weight alone changed the balance of a moment. Aaliyah did not know yet that Rothwell recognized the cadence of her speech the way someone recognizes a colleague's signature across time. She did not know, in that moment, that he had once attended lectures in Paris and had looked for a particular scholar in the city's corridors, searching for a mind he had admired years before. She only noticed him as another person watching, another pair of eyes. Because Rothwell was the owner of the establishment, watchers turned. Because he carried the authority of the room, others turned with him. He rose slowly. It was a motion that did not seek attention but that ordered it by default. Chairs scraped as he moved, the sound thin and certain. Victor's face changed into a different calculation, relief and fear braided together. The man who ran the floor knew that any move from Rothwell might save the staff from making a wrong choice, or might cut them off from profit. In the pause that followed, something like fragility walked the room. Julian looked at Rothwell and then at Aaliyah in a way that was not merely apologetic. He was measuring consequences now. He was balancing the small, Immediate victory of humiliation against the long-term cost of spectacularly alienating the one man in the room whose displeasure carried influence beyond a single dinner bill. Aaliyah felt the current of the room pulled as if a tide had shifted. Had she done this deliberately? Had she planned to be the center of a moral reckoning, in a room where moral reckoning was inconvenient? Her throat constricted, not from fear, but from the awareness that a sequence of small axe words on the tongue, a refusal to be invisible, had led her to a place where larger things could move. She did not know the scope of what Rothwell might do. She only knew that if something came now, it would be because she had chosen to speak. Julian opened his mouth, a motion that used to be decisive in any room he entered. The apology that followed was quick and measured, the kind that tries to become a closing act. "I misread the situation," he said in a tone that suggested he had not misread at all. Elena's hand found the back of his chair. She looked at Aaliyah with a new softness, registering, perhaps, the discomfort that came from seeing a cruel gesture reflected back like a mirror. For the first time all evening, Aaliyah noticed a small scrap of paper Elena palmed under her napkin. A private note, perhaps an afterthought of conscience, a story of small mercy. The first knot of the crisis had not yet Julian still sat with his card in his hand, a fact that would later be described in headlines or whispers as the moment when arrogance collided with consequence. The staff were caught mid-motion between compliance and the instinct to defend. Aaliyah stood the way a person stands on a cliff present, aware, awaiting a shift. Maximilian Rothwell closed the space between them with a gait that refused spectacle. He did not sweep into the room to rescue an underling. He did not raise his voice, because authority rarely needs to shout. He crossed the dining room in a series of quiet, inevitable steps, and the rest of the room rearranged itself in recognition of the slow gravity of his approach. Conversation dimmed like a stage light. Even the kitchen staff, who existed in a different tempo, seemed to notice. Aaliyah felt his gaze land on her, and it was like something measuring for a fit. Rothwell's face, in the close light, was not given to excess. He carried an air that suggested he had invested in many things, museums, chairs, institutes, but tonight his attention was simply on another human being. He knew who could help projects and who could be a disaster. He also understood that people were not merely instruments. He was the kind of person who made offers quietly and meant them. No one spoke for several beats. The dining room, that theater of small cruelties and careful civility, was suspended. Julian's card folded into his hand like an apology that had lost its power. Victor looked as if he might exhale and then remembered he had no right to that luxury. Rothwell stopped within a few feet of Aaliyah. He inclined his head, not a bow, not a flourish, but a small acknowledgement that registered in a room like a bell. He lifted a hand toward Julian with a casual, incisive motion that suggested he had all the time in the world to correct what had been broken. The motion was less about asserting dominance and more about insisting on the rules of how people, those who owned rooms, to behave. And there, in that charged silence, Aaliyah realized the power of speaking, that a single properly chosen response could not merely wound an arrogant man, could not merely make a billion-dollar ego wince, but could, perhaps, invite a different kind of reckoning. She could not know what Rothwell would do. All she knew was that she had refused to be the invisible architecture of someone else's performance. The room held its breath. The next move would determine whether this would be an evening folded back into polite forgetfulness or the beginning of a reckoning that could change reputations and rearrange power. Julian's attitude had altered already, small, immediate, and palpably anxious. It was a beginning. The rest was waiting to be written. Rothwell's voice arrived as if it had been whispered for years and finally decided to speak. It was small, courteous, and absolute, a sound that did not need upturn or flourish to take command. "Mr. Blackwood," he said, and the name in his mouth folded the room into a new geometry. "Would you mind checking again?" There was no rancor in the sentence. There was simply an invitation to account, an expectation that a man who demanded deference should be precise when he sought it. Julian's hand trembled a fraction as he fumbled his jacket again. The card was there. It had been all along. His face thinned as color reached. The apology that came this time felt like tissue paper held to a burn, thin, too quick, an attempt to silence the heat. Rothwell did not let the apology slide into the evening's background. He allowed the moment to expand instead of letting it be swept. A public accusation, he said, eyes steady, is different from a misstep in private. Both can be corrected, but one leaves a stain on people who can't afford stains. His words were not theatrical. They were precise accounting. The room took the measure of them. Julian's smile tried on contrition and found it ill-fitting. He attempted to compress the evening back into the usual ledger of favors and social currency. Obviously an honest mistake, he offered, and looked around as if he might salvage a friendlier atmosphere with speed and the right sort of glance. Rothwell's attention slid, briefly, and with the ease of someone accustomed to reading rooms, across the staff at Victor's clenched jaw, Marcel's taut hands, Sasha's reddened eyes. "Mr. Blackwood," he said again, now practical and without ceremony, "we keep careful accounts here. Reputation is one of them. When those accounts are damaged by a guest's actions, there are institutional remedies. Contracts have clauses, credit lines, respond to risk. I've seen a man lose more than his temper when he misused his influence." The words were less a threat than a reality statement. Financial mechanisms and reputational consequences, named in the plain voice of a man who understood them. In Julian's face there was a flicker that could be read as calculation. He had always used money and position as shields, and the thought of a shield peeled away, even slightly, tightened his mouth. Victor shifted, the manager's muscles searching for the ladder of procedure. "Sir? Perhaps an apology," his voice tried to bridge, to keep the establishment afloat between powerful customers and the dignity of the staff. Rothwell inclined his head toward Aaliyah, who had been standing very still, the room's light mapping the lines of a face that had learned to hold both fatigue and clarity. "Miss Vance," he said, and it had the soft, private tone of a man addressing a colleague in a library. "Would you join me for a moment?" The invitation was surgical. It lifted Aaliyah out of the spectacle without making her a charity case. Victor exhaled a small sound that might have been relief. Julian's apology, now fully formed, felt inadequate against the weight of the man at the head of the room. He attempted again, to little effect. Elena's fingers tightened at the napkin until the fabric creased. There was an expression in her eyes that had been morphing from amusement into something like regret. They walked together to the small, private room off the dining area that Rothwell used when patrons needed discretion. The light there was softer, the walls lined with the kind of books that smelled like dust and careful hands. Rothwell closed the door with a sound that signaled, simply, that the next words would be less for spectacle than for consequence. Once inside, Rothwell did not lean or pontificate. He asked, "You studied in Paris?" "Yes." Aaliyah's surprise flashed across her face for the barest instant on astonishment at recognition. "Sorbonne." "Briefly," she said. The phrasing was economical. She had not mentioned it at work. She had sealed the papers of that life letters, a half-finished thesis, into a drawer like a relic. Rothwell nodded. "I remember a lecture on language and power. I attended once, long ago. Your inflection in the dining room, there's the particular tilt of someone who has been taught to listen for subtle forms. I wish you had not needed to show it tonight." Aaliyah bristled, without wanting to. "I didn't come to be noticed," she said. "I came to work." "And yet you were," Rothwell observed, with the gentleness of someone cataloging a fact. "And because you spoke when you were spoken to as less than a person, people have seen something they didn't expect to see." He paused. "That matters." She had expected patronizing offers, sugar-coated, small mercies that would have left her role and responsibilities the same. Instead, Rothwell spoke with the language of institutions rather than charity. "I can't undo what happened here," he said, "but there are things I can do. The institute I chair has a program for cultural research, and we've been searching for someone to lead a particular project on endangered languages and sociolinguistic dignity. When I heard you speak tonight, I recognized an intellect I had been hoping to find. I'm not offering alms. I'm offering work that matches what you have been trained to do." Aaliyah's reaction was a tide of feeling that she kept controlled. Alarm, hope, suspicion. "Why me?" she asked. Practicality first, always. "Why now?" "Because it's the right fit," Rothwell said simply, and because the institution has resources to care for people more broadly than a salary, if you accept, we can also provide support for your father's care at the Rothwell Neurological Center. There will be autonomy. There will be an adequate salary. And there will be respect for your work. I expect rigor, and I will provide the means. She thought about shapes of dignity, about the difference between a check and a place where her knowledge would be recognized. She thought of the trailer of receipts under a mattress, of a thesis that smelled of coffee and failure and the ache of interrupted plans. This isn't charity, she said, not as a reproach, but as a necessary clarification. I won't take a job that treats me like a curiosity. Rothwell smiled, but not in a way that's soft obligation. Neither do I offer it as one. He slid a small card across the table that bore the name of the institute and an email address. Consider it an invitation to professionalism. Take your time. I do not make hasty hires. I make decisions by evidence. Outside, the dining room had not dissolved back into its original shape. People still noted edges the way Julian ate quietly now. The avoidance in some conversations. Elena excused herself from the table under the pretense of fresh air and stood for a long minute in a doorway, watching the staff who had been seen. When she slipped, later, a folded scrap of paper into Marcel's Hondan apology to him for witnessing wrong, no one made much of the small act. It was too private for the room, and too public for the table. Julian left before the check arrived. He was careful to be small. He wanted, perhaps, to lessen the risk of another scene. The day will come, Rothwell's words suggested, when a reputation is balanced and counted, and those balances sometimes tip. He walked away with the same tailored gait. He would tell himself later that he had been embarrassed, not revealed. The following morning the staff gathered in the back room for a brief meeting. Victor called. There were no gradations, no disclosures of Rothwell's offer. People passed around the tattered pack of tips and tried to forget the shape of the evening. Marcel put his hand on Alea's shoulder, an unadorned gesture that asked not for a story, but for a shared understanding. Sasha made a pot of coffee with her hands that stiffened around the mug, as if ritual could make the day straight again. Aaliyah walked home with the card in her pocket. The city smelled of winter shifting toward spring. She held the Sorbonne acceptance photograph in her hand for a time before tucking it back into its drawer. There were practicalities to consider. She would have to speak with Samuel's doctors, plan for continuity of care, consider leaving a job that, despite everything, paid the rent in increments she had grown to trust. But there was, for the first time in years, an open possibility that her life could make space for the work inside her, that the thesis might one day see daylight. She wrote Rothwell the next day, not a plea, not a supplication, but a letter of interest and conditions. He answered with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been waiting and had the institutional capacity to move when the right person appeared. He arranged an initial meeting with a formal contract, terms that included autonomy for her research, a living wage for her family, an explicit healthcare placement for Samuel at the Rothwell Neurological Institute. The language of the contract was measured and concrete. It used no metaphors of salvation. It referenced positions and expectations and the safeguards that ensured academic freedom. When she visited the institute weeks later, Rothwell took her through a small office that looked out over a courtyard planted with plane trees. The building had the smell of old books and a refrigerator humming somewhere in an office that housed research assistants. He introduced her to administrators who discussed budgets and potential grant partners with a language she had been trained to love: feasibility, sustainability, peer review. The offer was what he had promised: no charity in the texture of it, only a recognition that her skills could be used in a way that restored both dignity and purpose. Aaliyah accepted. The contract would allow her to set up a team, reach out to former mentors, and publish work that connected endangered dialects to issues of social recognition. For Samuel, there was a coordinated plan: specialized therapy, a room in the rehabilitation wing where he could be treated by teams familiar with strokes and long-term recovery, and the administrative bandwidth for insurance and care coordination that she had never had before. The news did not change the world overnight, but it rearranged certain private scales. Victor smiled like a man who had seen a small miracle that was not miraculous gust sensible use of the resources that already existed. Marcel hugged Aaliyah in the alley behind the restaurant and whispered that he'd auditioned for a language class if it meant he could be around the lectures. Sasha cried into her apron for reasons both private and communal. Weeks later, when Aaliyah walked into the rehab center for the first time with the Rothwell staff escorting her, Samuel looked at her with a confusion that shifted into recognition. It was not cinematic, there were tremors and silences and slow articulations, but there was a moment when the old warmth crossed his face like a sunlight striped through blinds. He squeezed her hand in a gesture that was weary but alive. The first sentence he said was small and unadorned. "Oh, Ali." It came out halting, syllables spaced as if found anew. Aaliyah's breath caught up somewhere under her collarbone, and she did not think to be self-conscious about the tears on her face as she answered him. Rothwell's intervention had not been a blinding cure. Therapies were long, payment plans had to be negotiated, physical strength had to be rebuilt. But the institutional scaffolding he placed around them meant that Sam would not have to be shuffled from one inadequate clinic to the next. Someone would coordinate his care. Someone would fund the therapies that insurance balked at. It was pragmatic restoration, a sustained arrangement that allowed for progress. As Aaliyah's work at the Institute settled into rhythm, the city noticed in the subtle ways institutions notice, invitations to speak at panels that had once felt out of reach, a small profile in a journal that had a readership in academic circles, a grant committee asking for a proposal. She was careful, always, to keep the ledger honest. She did not seize every spotlight, but when she stood at a podium months later and spoke about language, identity, and the dignity that recognition can afford, the crowd listened. Her voice, once relegated to the din of a kitchen and the polite murmurs of a dining room, now held the authority of someone who had been trained and then trusted. Those months also revealed their own reckonings for Julian Blackwood. The sequence of consequences was not the melodrama of gossip, but the slow unwind of financial and social friction. Clients withdrew modestly at first, then in clusters as business partners grew wary of reputational exposure. Boards whispered about risk. Investors who cared more about steady returns than sharp headlines began to call for governance reviews. The particulars of balance sheets and margin calls are dull in prose. The effect was not a single dramatic collapse but the attrition of influence. In society's ledger, where intimacy and reputation are counted, a man who weaponizes his entitlement against the vulnerable can find his networks frayed. Elena disentangled herself in small, evident ways. She wrote a note to Aaliyah, short, hand-pressed letter that acknowledged her shame and her gratitude. "Thank you for showing me what I did not see." It read. She did not attempt to intervene publicly on Julian's behalf. The people who had once been part of his social orbit found new alignments. Some stayed in the old circles, others stepped away. Julian's anger retreated from public view and became a private thing he cultivated in boardrooms and short, private phone calls. He offered apologies that read like exercises in restoring a balance sheet rather than making amends. Rothwell's role remained quietly institutional. He attended Aaliyah's early lectures and, on occasion, spoke in panel introductions that placed her work within a larger project he had funded for years. He remained somewhat aloof from sentimentality. He pointedly insisted that the Institute's relationship with Aaliyah was professional, not paternalistic. "She is a scholar," he would say to anyone who asked, "and we need her voice at the center of this work." The staff at the restaurant saw the changes radiate outward in small ways. Victor received a note of commendation from a regular after the incident, the one who had been watching the staff's restrained dignity and decided to tip not only for service but for standing up. Marcel found himself recommending courses to friends. Sasha enrolled in a night class that Rothwell's office said they'd sponsor as part of a staff development effort. The restaurant itself adjusted its training manuals to include clearer protections for staff against patronized accusations, not because of heroics, but because a man with authority had pointed out procedural integrity as a part of doing business. 6 months after the night that had tilted their lives, the Rothwell Institute held a small symposium on endangered dialects. Aaliyah spoke on a panel and the room was, full academics, funders, and a scattering of people who had once seen her move through a dining room tray in hand. Samuel sat near the back in a specially arranged seat, his speech slower and his eye clearer than it had been the winter before. In a moment that was quietly enormous for the family, he read a line from a children's book, a loud, halting but unmistakable, and when he finished, Aaliyah felt something in her chest unclench that had been holding since his stroke. The evening after the symposium, they went to a small dinner, arranged by the Institute. It was not the lacquered excess of the Rothwell Lounge, but a modest table lit by candles and warmth. Rothwell sat at the end and did not make a show of his patronage. He spoke about the next stage of the program, about grants and fellowships, and the need to train community researchers who could both document dialects and advocate for recognition. He listened more than he talked. There was a moment when he looked at Aaliyah, and whatever threads of formality lay between them loosened into something less hierarchical and more mutual. "You were right to speak," he said simply. Elena's note arrived in Aaliyah's office weeks later. It contained no grand flourish. "I am sorry," I laughed. It read, "You were braver than I was. Thank you." Elena would go on to do the quiet work many people who once traveled in wealth find themselves wanting to do when the gloss has worn away. Small donations to clinics, private letters to people she'd met and wronged, a donation to the Institute that did not require fan. For Aaliyah, the recompense was not only external, the work she'd in interviewing elders who still remembered lullabies in dialects long thought extinct, designing community archives that made knowledge public rather than sequestered felt like the repair of a life. She reworked chapters of her thesis and published articles that referenced both linguistic structure and the ethics of attention. People began to call her for interviews, but more importantly, colleagues called her to collaborate. A once shelved paper became a draft for a larger project that would involve community scholars across regions. At night, when the apartment was quiet and Samuel slept fitfully, Aaliyah would read aloud to him passages from the dissertation she had once almost completed. Her voice was steady now, practiced again for different audiences. Sometimes the words would catch on his lips and he'd try to reproduce a phrase with a sound of concentration. The smallness of that progress would silence any triumphalism she might have felt. She did not forget the humiliation evening. She carried it like a scar that taught her where to hold tenderness for others. Julian's presence in the institutional circuits, she moved and dwindled. When his firm announced internal reorganizations, the press noted nothing salacious. The notes read like any corporate memo. Yet when people in those rooms decided to be cautious, they often aired reasons without naming the night at Rothwell. Reputation is an aggregate of small signals. One insolent performance amplifies others. For Julian, the evening had been a needle that unpicked a seam of goodwill he'd hitherto assumed would hold. Months later, Aaliyah received an email short, business-like from a conference organizer, asking her to present her recent findings. The invitation listed a panel and a keynote and a small honorarium. She thought, for a moment, of the night she'd been asked to bow into invisibility. She thought of the way language had been used as both weapon and shelter. She accepted. On the morning of the keynote, Samuel squeezed her hand in the lobby of the Institute and pointed at a photograph on the wall, an old group shot from a community archive they'd assembled where his younger self stood with his family in a garden no longer there. "You look like you did," he said, voice thin but luminous. "Proud." Aaliyah smiled with a fullness that had not been possible to winters before. She walked onto the stage and looked out at the audience. Colleagues who had read her papers, funders who had made grants, students who had once watched her pass with a tray. She spoke about dignity and the right to be heard. She spoke without the need to exact revenge. Her words were not about punishment, but about repair and responsibility. The auditorium listened, and applause that was not merely polite but sincere filled the room. It landed on her like recognition, not rescue. When the talk ended, a small cluster of people gathered to speak with her, young scholars, older colleagues, and a woman who introduced herself as a representative from an international foundation. They talked about funding and methodology and, quietly, about ethics. Aaliyah found herself giving directions and making plans. She did not feel smaller. She felt allotted more room to do the work she had been meant for. On the plane ride home that evening, she opened a small folder that contained correspondence from Rothwell's office. a note about a new fellowship, a schedule for publication milestones, a line item that ensured Samuel's ongoing care. There were no grand brokered proclamations in it, only logistics, well written and precise. She folded the paper carefully and put it back in the folder. There are moments in which a life rearranges around an action and does not return to what it had been. Aaliyah knew that her choice to speak had consequences that reached beyond any single dinner. It had cost her the convenience of remaining invisible. It had forced her into a spotlight she had not asked for in easy terms. And in that spotlight, there were obligations she now embraced. She also knew that the world had not been redeemed. Not every arrogant man would be taught humility by a single evening. Not every institution would feel obliged to act. But the dinner at Rothwell had shown that language can be a means of resistance, and that institutions with resources, when properly wielded, can repair rather than patronize. In quieter moments, she would think of Victor, balancing the competing ledgers of profit and human decency. She would remember Marcel and Sasha and their small acts of solidarity. She would sometimes imagine Julian in a room gone smaller than the one he preferred, compelled to measure the cost of his gestures. She did not wish him ruin. She wished him sight. The city's seasons turned. Samuel's speech grew steadier, and his hand no longer trembled when he reached for a spoon. Aaliyah's name appeared in a program for a larger, international symposium. A note from Elena arrived months later, simple, without melodrama, an invitation to join a private conversation about philanthropic strategy. Elena wrote that she had learned how dangerous small cruelties could be and wanted to try to do something different. The note was not redemption. It was a small admission and a tentative opening. At the center of these ripples stood a woman who had once been asked to be invisible and chose instead to speak with the exactness of a trained mind. Her response had not only unsettled a billionaire in a single night, it had set into motion a chain of accountability, institutional repair, and personal restoration. The billionaire's attitude had changed not by a magic reformation, but by the arrival of consequences he could not afford to ignore, and the presence of someone with authority who refused to let the moment be minimized. She would sometimes, in private, repeat the small provencal phrase she'd used that night, not to rehearse victory, but to remind herself of the place from which she had sprung. Language, she understood now more than before, was both armor and architecture. It defended, and it constructed. It could make you visible in a room that had practiced ignoring you. And when paired with institutions willing to act, it could turn a moment into a sustained possibility. When the camera crews and gossip columns had moved on, and the dinner had become a story people told in fragments, the quieter work continued. Conferences, grant applications, therapy sessions, teaching, and the slow accretions of progress in Samuel's rehabilitation. Rothwell remained a steward who measured outcomes and expected rigor. Aaliyah remained a scholar who walked the thin line between gratitude and autonomy. On an evening, months later, she sat on a bench outside the institute and opened an old notebook that held a half-finished chapter. She made a small notation and then looked up at the city. A taxi idled at the curb. A couple argued quietly over a map. Someone played a distant trumpet. Nothing about the skyline had changed, but many small things had. She had, finally, the space to finish what she had begun. If this story has spoken to you, that a single act of refusal can be the hinge of something larger, consider staying for more stories like this. There are other quiet reckonings, other people whose small acts rearranged places and lives. If you want to see more of them, subscribe and follow the playlist of similar narratives. Aaliyah folded the notebook and stood. She walked through the institute's doors into the warm light of a room where, at long last, her voice was not a surprise but a thing expected and listened to. Her response had changed a billionaire's attitude, but more importantly, it had changed the map of her life and the lives that mattered to her. The rest, she understood, would be built one careful, sustained sentence at a time.